is being recorded as of now. I'm going to start sharing my screen. And what we're going to discuss today is REST, MVC, and forms. There's a couple of different things to go through, all of which are incredibly important. REST and MVC are really important design principles that kind of influence every decision made across any sort of server. I'll get into what they mean a little bit more. But they're things that don't go away. And while they feel like design patterns and just rules that we're saying right now that like you can hack your way through without, they like not following a RESTful pattern is a red flag for people who are trying to hire you. And not following MVC, same reason. And also by learning REST and MVC, I think you all kind of can get a sort of sense of the pattern in this program by this point, where we teach you the fundamentals and the basics, and then we also teach you the conventions that are kind of rules, and then we give you a tool that goes, oh hey, you followed this convention, cool, I'll do everything for you. When it comes to REST and MVC, that's no different. Eventually, if you understand REST and MVC, you will be able to do immensely powerful things with the Rails in a matter of seconds. So we're going to dive into that a little bit. But first, I think so there's a couple of different topics. First, I just want to talk a little bit about the internet. So when we talk about REST, it's a pretty academic topic in terms of it is based off of someone's PhD thesis or their dissertation. And it's like, if you read this Wikipedia article, you will find it very complicated and messy. What it really was it was an attempt to formalize a couple of good design patterns from the internet that like we're starting to develop into a series of rules that would then allow that will then, like, if developers followed them, would allow for best practices so developers would be able to understand your code, people who are navigating your code will be able to understand your code, and it's still used to this day. What we're going to be talking about primarily is RESTful routing, which is how we can build URLs that scale well, that make sense, and that users and developers can follow what you're doing. And it's really important that we get this. I know it feels really niche. I know it's based on academic stuff. It's super important to the functioning of Sinatra and Rails. It's super important to being a good developer. You will see all over the place when you try to hit APIs yourself that, like, hey, this is a RESTful API. What this is saying is use this. It's not complicated and awful. We actually put some thought into it. And so basically, when we get down to what RESTful routing is and what REST is, first, let's talk about how annoying it was to navigate the internet before. We're back on the Space Jam website. Now, from this point, we're at jam.htm, which is a great name for a page. It doesn't say anything. And in fact, none of these links really give you a sense. I don't know what Planet B-Ball is. I might, after going to a website and like clicking on it for a while, clicking on it, I get B-Ball/B-Ball frames. And I don't know what this page is at all. I'm going to click on it. Cool, we get somewhere else. I have no idea where I am. We can click around, and this is just an easy website to get lost in. And some of that is their UI, right? Their UI is really interesting, but not necessarily useful. But part of it is also just, it's not, their development process wasn't built around understanding things RESTfully. Yeah, terrible font contrast too. And if you start from RESTful thinking, you'll find that your code is way more organized, and you'll also find that other people can navigate your site better. I was thinking about, like, hey, what's a great website to represent RESTful routing for this lecture? And I was all right, well, Facebook does it somewhat, like blah blah blah. They all like do a couple of different customizations on it, and like then I was just like, okay, I need something simple here rather than like logging into my Facebook and showing you some examples of RESTful routing on my Facebook, which would be a little intrusive for me. And then I realized, hey, we're going to be building out the Breaking Bad app. Let's take a look at the Breaking Bad API. The Breaking Bad API is RESTful. So that's just a good sense of like, hey, it's the first thing that we're going to be using today. And it is itself RESTful. What RESTful really what like REST as a dissertation, it's big kind of, if I want to boil down like a really advanced dissertation to like a couple of different observations, the big one is that the things that we serve on the internet can be outlined as resources. Whether it is I want to show a list of characters, or I want to show movies, or I want to show quotes. They are all kinds of resources. And resources have like 4 different behaviors and 7 different routes that kind of make sense for all of them. The 4 different behaviors are that a user might want to read a resource, a user might want to create a resource, a user might want to be able to update a resource, and a user might want to be able to delete a resource. When we talk about these actions together, usually we say CRUD actions: create, read, update, delete. Those are the 4 kinds of things that you want to do to resources on the internet. If I want to find out about a character, I will be reading from that character. If I want to create a character, I want to add a character to the database, so it would be a create action. If I want to update a character, that would be an update action, right? And then there's also delete, which is self-explanatory. So recognizing that anything that you're serving on the internet can be reduced to a resource that you do those 4 actions on led to a lot of convention that's really, really useful for us. So when we talk about RESTful routing, this is basically a kind of cheat sheet that I stole from some student's blog. I haven't even fully fact checked it because I know I know that as we go through this, if I see something weird, I will show you another resource. But I want an image that I could easily crop. So RESTful routing, basically, if you were to create a resource for blogs, there would be 7 different routes that really make sense pretty much universally. There are certain routes that you might not use all the time, but these 7 routes are going to be things that I expect you to know. I want to expect you to be using the right URLs. I want you to be able to say what the route name is, whether it's index, new, create, show, edit, update, or destroy. And I want you to be able to describe the right HTTP verb. And we can talk a little about update. These are things that you will be tested on. And the reason you'll be tested on them is because it's something every junior developer should know. Whether or not you're going to end up building a RESTful app, it's the first thing you should be thinking of doing. Some websites will be like, okay, we had to move away from RESTful routing for this in this specific thing. They always made a conscious decision to do that. That was always a conversation, and you'll sound smarter if you understand it. It also is what Rails is based on. Rails will build this stuff for you if you know what you're doing. So so that's the reason we're testing you on it. It's important. So just, I know this is like one of those README heavy topics. I urge you not to skip it, and I urge you to get into the habit of just thinking about these 7 actions. So basically the basic idea is that there are, like, each of these 7 actions can pair with a URL and an HTTP verb. This is called RESTful routing, where if I want to see all of the blogs, I go to /blogs with a GET request, and it will display all the blogs. If I want to see one blog, I go to blogs / and then that blog's ID, and then it shows me that blog. There's a couple of others. New, this is one of the ones that you do away with depending on how you're developing. A lot of people like to serve their form on the same page, and with JavaScript, this becomes less and less important. But for the next 2 phases, it's going to be super important. New is a page that shows a form to build a new blog. Create then takes in what that form sends over with a post request, and then adds that blog to a database and does a redirect. Edit and update have the same pairing, where edit, you send over blog/1/edit. It'll show you a form for that blog. You send an update request to blogs/some sort of ID and use either a put or a patch statement. And then you probably redirect them afterwards. And destroy is always sent to blog/something or other, where that ID is the ID of something you want to destroy, and will usually involve a redirect because you don't usually show the user something that they just destroyed. I want to go over those once before we dive into the code. I'll be asking these questions constantly. I'll be like, hey, what's the URL for an index action? Or what's the name of this of this action, like a get request to blogs? You'd say index. What's the HTTP verb? These are things that you should just iron out, get down, and know how to talk about. Cool. Do you have questions on that?
So RESTful routing, is it just uses the HTTP verbs? That's what the routing is?
HTTP verb and the URL. So paired together will make the route. Here's a good resource called Restular. It's great. Just if you're ever wondering what to do. If I want to be like, hey, I've got a resource called movies. It will just print out these 7 RESTful routes. This is the most basic version of RESTful routing. There's also situations where like, hey, I want each movie to have several reviews. Like this will eventually be something we understand and we'll get to eventually. But this little pattern right here of using a get to /movies to indicate, hey, I want to show all movies will help. This whole tool is perhaps more helpful than I'd like it to be because it gives away a lot in terms of what is usually expected inside of those. So this is a little cheat sheet to understand RESTful routing. I would just dig into it. And then if you ever go like, hey, I don't understand this, just DM me. Cool.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. But you'll notice in the Breaking Bad API, get all characters, right? You go to API/characters. And API is just a sub at the beginning, but /characters, very RESTful. You want to see more information on a character? Characters/1. Go to the first character. Now, ordinarily, we're not like this. This doesn't have something for posting, right? Like I can't create a new character on Breaking Bad. We will eventually be doing that today. But like they had an index and a show route. Not all of your apps need all 7 RESTful actions. You will get into the habit of building them out constantly. Please don't build anything you don't need. Yagni, you ain't gonna need it, is still the principle. You can have a resource that only has 1 action. But like, do think, hey, is this something RESTful before you go into custom, like before you start building out custom routes? Some examples of non-custom or non-RESTful routing where you would be using custom routes. A homepage is a custom route. A lot of like a 404 page could be a custom route. Those don't have to be RESTful. But when you're thinking about resources, try to think in terms like whenever you're thinking about like, hey, this is a model in my database, that's usually a good indication that you want to do something RESTful. Cool.
Why isn't a homepage RESTful?
Because like, generally speaking, like we just want to show a homepage. We don't imagine that it represents a resource that we want to be able to like update eventually or to be able to create something with it. It's just a static web page that we need to serve to our users that does something.
Oh, so static web pages don't need to be okay, cool. Thank you.
And I'll talk a little bit about how we talk about static web pages in the MVC pattern. Next, this is I'm warning you, this is going to be a little bit more talking before we dive into the code. Then we're going to do a lot of coding. The second thing I want to talk about though is the MVC pattern. Does anyone know what MVC stands for?
model view controller.
That's exactly right. So the other thing that Sinatra and Rails apps highly rely on is the MVC pattern, which I think a lot of other, like most other backends and server-based stuff relies on. But it, along with RESTful routing, are the two conventions that kind of drive how Rails and how Sinatra work. The MVC pattern is a little bit more straightforward, but it's going to lead to some weird quirks when we think about it with RESTful routing. The MVC pattern is model view controller because those are the three parts of the app that it wants to think about. When we're building in Sinatra, I want you to think of where you should be coding anything you want to code. When we build stuff in controllers, right, there'll be, I don't have a controller next, like up right now, but it'll be tempting to be like, cool, I want to make an entire database query right here. I want to start doing database related analysis here. Like, for example, you might want to be like, hey, I'm going to create a form where if somebody sends something over, like a string, I want to be able to search based on that, hit my database, find everything with that name, and then show that back. There will be a tendency to want to code everything out in the controller. I am asking you now, don't do that. If it relates to your database, it's your model's job to deal with it. So you build out model methods to deal with dealing with the database. Code inside your models. Your controller's job should simply be to serve data to your views based on what they want. So to be like, hey, I've got your order. Here's your view. And your view's job should never be to hit the database. Ideally. Because at that point, that's stuff that you're giving out to your users, and you want to keep them as far away from your database as possible. The common analogy here, when we get to it, is that the model is the chef, the controller is the waiter, and the view is the menu or the food or whatever. Basically, the controller's job is to be the intermediary between the view and the model. So if like someone goes, hey, I want to see all of the red t-shirts, it should be your controller's job to then go like call a model method, say like, hey, they want red t-shirts. The model's job will be to like actually query the database for red t-shirts and then yield them back. Then it's the view's job to render them out. This is going to make more sense as we code it out, but I want to talk about it now. The other thing that's really important in MVC frameworks is that each model has their own controller. So each model that you plan on serving things from has their own controller. And this is just for the sake of organizing our code and making things pretty neat. I'm going to show you what I mean here. But basically, blogs will have a bunch of RESTful actions, right? And then a bunch of non-RESTful actions, maybe, depending on what you want to do. Then if I want to like create a separate thing called movies, that should have its own controller that handles those requests. And I'm going to show you how to do that today. So that's MVC and REST. I'm kind of breezing through it because I'm going to keep bringing it up for the rest of time. But like, do we have any questions before I dive into actually coding some stuff together? Cool. So in that case, I've like described in more detail what each of these things are. So like the model view controller, it's done here. I also have an example file structure for how we want to build our Sinatra apps. Got a lot of stuff on RESTful routing, and then some helpful other stuff that we can eventually get to. But to get started, right now I have our old Breaking Bad CLI app. I haven't done anything to it. Rake run. Like we can still go ahead and say cheese is my username, and then we can see all the characters, right? Cool. I think my actor feature isn't working. I think we did something wrong there. But that doesn't matter right now. Cool. So our goal for the rest of this little while is that at a certain point we are going to have moved this from the CLI to the internet. Cool. Today, what we're going to be doing is working only with the character model. And we will end up being able to create your own character. I know that's something I didn't want to do initially. But now I'm thinking it would, like, A, this will be a useful way to teach forms, and B, it would kind of be fun to insert some original characters or characters from other stuff into Breaking Bad's universe. So at this point, we're going to go through all the process that we would normally go through of setting up a Sinatra app. So we can start by creating a config.ru file, right? Cool. And that's going to go ahead and require our environment, right? Cool. I'm going to end up fixing this. But I'm also going to, whoops, nope. No, do not open up my messenger. Cool. Thank you. Bundle add. Let's go ahead and add Sinatra itself. We have Sinatra active record. It'd be nice to have Sinatra. Bundle add rack. Bundle add shotgun. Cool. And also at this point, this is getting really gross in terms of the environment. So I'm going to bundle add a little gem called require all, which will make making this a little bit neater. So I'm going to really quickly first break console, make sure we didn't break anything. Character.all still works. Cool. Now I can just comment these bad boys out. Require all app. And that's going to go from my root directory into my app folder and require every file inside of it. It's a helpful little gem, right? Let's test that works. Character.all still shows up. Any questions there? That was just a helpful little gem that I want to show you at one point. Cool. So we just installed a few different gems and then got back to functional and then changed this to require all apps so I don't have to type that every time. Great. Cool. So next up, right? Basically, our app folder is going to be where we do a lot of the development work in terms of the models, views, and controllers. In fact, those are three folders that I think are necessary in a full stack Rails app. So I'm just going to, whoops, controllers. Cool. I'm also going to have views. And we'll talk about this in a second. Great. So now if we want to like actually just go back, like set up a Sinatra app, all we need to do is create what I'm going to call the application controller, which is the main controller of our application. I did this last time. In this time, you're going to see a little bit more why I like call this application controller and what we're doing here. So we're going to have an application controller that inherits from Sinatra base, right? Do a get to slash do hello world, right? Let's just test this out. And then in our config.ru file, what we just need to do is say run application controller. And this is going to be loaded in through our environment file right here with require all app. And we can try this out with shotgun. Oh, cool. Little spoiler for you in that URL. So now if we go here, we get hello world. Before we go any further, how was that for everyone? We just set Sinatra up in an app. Like it was crazy that happened that quickly. We just installed 3 gems, right? And then created a config.ru file, inherited from Sinatra base, and wrote this. And suddenly we're on the internet. Like that was crazy. That was a lot of things that we did just really quickly right there. We feeling good? Thumbs up, thumbs sideways, thumbs down. Cool. Here, I'm going to show you this little thing right here. I normally just copy and paste into every single bit of application controller I do. It's just helpful. So instead of doing hello world, I don't want to do that yet. These 2 lines of code are great. This one says, hey, the views are going to be in this folder right here in app/views. And then we're also going to create a folder called public that's going to be helpful for any sort of public resources that would whoops, let's move this over here, that help our app out. Oh, I already built one. No, I don't want to. Cool. I did this one in advance. Delete public. Cool. So I've already got a public folder here because I prepped. And inside it, I have my style sheets folder and then just like some sample CSS. That's like a normal thing to put inside your public folder. Other things that you put inside a public folder, JavaScript, anything that you're going to be loading from your HTML, having a public folder for it is really helpful. So just tacking this on to your application controller will allow it to do a lot of the functionalities of like that would normally relate to like your views and your JavaScripts and your style sheets in this format. Cool. I don't expect you to memorize how to write this. I do expect you to kind of know what it's doing, saying like, hey, this is where the views are going to be by default inside of app/views. And this public folder /public is where you should go for all. You should basically set these as resources that you can access on the open internet. Cool.
Is there any instance where you would set those to other things?
Yeah, if you want to get like a little bit fancy with the spices, right? Or in like some cases, right? There might be a place where you're like, hey, I'm working on multiple different versions of this app. You might want to have like app/v1/views right here. That would be a normal situation. It's very defaulted in Rails. I don't even know how to customize in Rails. So generally speaking, if I don't know how to customize in Rails, it means that you're probably going to just be doing this every time.
Makes sense.
But yeah.
Thanks.
Cool. So our application controller can in itself do all of our Sinatra stuff. We can do get to /hello do but hello is now in the console. And then hello, you successfully said hi to the console, right? Now we go to 9393/hello. I hope it doesn't crash. You successfully said hi to the console. We can test this out. Hello is now in the console. So we did say hi to the console. Puts doesn't go away. We're still just running Ruby. So we did a put statement. It's in the console.
Is there ever a time that would be like useful to put something to the console at the same time?
Yes.
Okay.
Very like first off, it's really helpful for debugging. Like eventually if you're deploying stuff to the internet, the way you're going to find out about errors is they're going to print in the console and you'll do like logs, or you'll have some other tracking like for it. But puts is still going to be useful. In alternate situation, I just like also want to show you that we can still do side effects here. Like I can go ahead and send a request to the open internet and say to someone else, hey, they said hello to me, and then like post something. you can do whatever you want here. You like, I would still recommend model view controller logic, right? You don't do anything here that doesn't relate to yielding something to the user. But a put statement is like kind of the one little exception.
Is putsing to this console the same as, will that show up in the console and inspector tools in Chrome as well?
No.
That's the same thing.
Those are two different consoles. That's the JavaScript console.
Gotcha. Okay.
So, and that one's going to be a little bit more interesting to hit. I could probably do it by doing something like, no, we'll do that. That's well past this. But yeah, different consoles.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Raquel, yes, it just directs the controller to where everything is. And it like makes the public folder public. And we'll get to what that does in a bit with the public folder, but yes.
I actually have a follow-up question to that. So when I was working on the labs, I had to like call set views and then to the specific path that views was in because it wasn't defaulting to it. Is that something that we generally will have to do?
If you're coding in Sinatra, yeah, I think it's helpful to always explicitly do this.
Okay.
And also heads up, one thing that I want to flag, some of these labs aren't RESTful and don't use the MVC pattern. The early ones don't do that because we want to teach you that later. So like a lot of them have like stuff going on in application controller, have views in unexpected places. The way I'm teaching you is the way that I want you to do it for your project. Cool. So we're going to get rid of this. And now we get to, okay, cool. We have this application controller. Now with an MVC pattern, how do we have multiple controllers? So the way that this works, and the reason this application controller is so important, is we can go ahead and we can create a new controller that I'm going to call characters controller. .rb. I want you to always pluralize the name of your model of your resource in your controller. In your model, it should be singular. In your controller, you're dealing with many requests to many characters. So the convention is to pluralize it. Cool. Here, in this situation, now that we have this characters controller, right? We do not inherit from active or from Sinatra base in our subsidiary controllers. Here's the twist. Now that we have this beautiful application controller that inherits from Sinatra base, we can go ahead and say, hey, inherit from the application controller. And this does a lot for us. First off, we can just start writing code in here and it will start behaving as if we coded it in application controller. But if we can like make sure that all of our routes relate to characters. Eventually you will use the same thing to do authorization for you, to be like, hey, I'm going to define some stuff in application controller that are some helper methods that will allow me to be like, hey, give me their cookie. Let's parse this into an ID. And then let's translate this into who the current user is. And then all you'll need to do in characters controller is call current user. That's a little bit far down the line, but that's the sort of thing that having a separate application controller can do for us, in addition to just breaking out our code in neat ways. Cool. So from here, I can now write any Sinatra stuff I want. I can go ahead and say get to /hello, do, and hi. And now did you say, oh, right. There's one other thing I need to do. Sorry, I totally forgot about this. It is in the README. When we create a controller in Sinatra in our config.ru file, we have to write use characters controller before we run application controller. Saying, hey, use these controllers as well. Cool? We cool here with this? Now if we refresh the page, we've got hello to hi. Now we can start building cool stuff. I realize this was a lot of like setup and talking about best practices before you've actually seen it coded. And usually I like to code and then learn the best practices. So thank you for bearing with me. The rest of this will hopefully be a little fun. So before we dive into this like actually creating our RESTful actions, which we'll talk about in a second. There is something we can do now that we have this sort of pattern down. In our views, or first off, let's actually go ahead and we'll do a get slash characters real quick, and we'll render something as ERB. So ERB. So normally for the past while we've done something like ERV like index or something like that. Now that we're working in subsidiary folders, I'm going to create a new folder in views that says characters. Cool. And inside there, I'm going to create index.html or .erb rather. We can say h1 / h1. This will eventually be our index. Cool. Now, if I'm doing it this way, I have to go ahead and just use this weird syntax right here. Symbol and then open strings, characters / index. Let's test this out. Cool. So we're just saying, hey, ERB, this specific folder, the characters folder, this specific file. Great. Now, one cool thing that views will also allow us to do, we create something called layout.erb. Sinatra will try to do this first. Let's go ahead and say, and this is, so I'm going to show you exactly what this is, and then we can talk about it. Cool. Let's go ahead and say HTML / HTML. Bet we need like some sort of, it's been so long since I typed this out. This is probably wrong, but it's not going to break, which is going to make it worse for me because then I'm going to be like, cool, this didn't break, so it must be right. But it's just that Google's being helpful for me. We can go ahead and say title. Welcome to my cool web page / title.
I mean, assuming we're working in ERB, do we really need to like say like HTML, or is this just like a friendly thing to other developers who are working on it?
It's good to just include this at the top of your, I forget what the boilerplate is. Where it's like doc type.
Oh,
Let's take a look.
Left thing and the exclamation point.
Yeah, here we go. That's exactly what I was looking for. So this just goes ahead and tells like Chrome what the document's going to be. Otherwise, it's going to make its best guess and usually come up with HTML. I've never seen a situation where this doesn't work. Still best practice if you're writing a layout to do this. Cool. I'm just going to right now say every page rendered as ERB will now have a cheese emoji. Then I will try to remember the shortcut for it. Yeah, there we go. Cool. And then remember this weird thing that you had one lab on, yield. I said that this would be useful for exactly one purpose. Right now, it's really useful if you're like coding out tools and macros and gems, where you want to be able to like use somebody else's do block. But it is for now just going to be something that when you put it inside of your layout.erb, it will render any ERB file, like any HTML you build in an ERB file, it will render it inside that section. So like if my ERB file says this will eventually be our index, it will be under a bunch of cheeses right now. Cool. That's what yield will do for us.
What will yield in that case?
It will yield our index.erb if we're going to index. If we go to a different thing that renders a different ERB, it will render that instead. It's easier to just show you here. So right here, if I go to characters, every page renders ERB will now have a cheese emoji, a bunch of cheeses, and then it renders out, this will eventually be our index. We can go ahead and say, yes, great. Cool. So what I'm doing here, this right here comes from our index.erb. That's what's being rendered out from characters, but it's all being wrapped in a bunch of code like this. Because the index.erb is being pushed in as the result of this yield action inside of our document. So this, everything that's not yield should be the template for all of your web pages. Does that make a little bit of sense?
How does the yield know to grab index.erb?
Because our characters controller is rendering characters/index. So it's just because we've defined our views like this, right? It's going to look for something named layout.erb, and it's going to put index.erb inside of it if it can. Cool. If we go ahead and say get to /cheese, do ERB characters cheese, and we create a new file right here that just says Gouda, right? Right now, this characters thing will still look the same, right? But now if I go to cheese, it says Gouda inside of there instead. This is how the layout file works. And it's useful for a couple of things. One, loading up your CSS in one place and like all of your rules of your application, like and all your metadata. So like, welcome to my cool web page. That's probably not going to change because it's a very cool web page. I'm definitely going to change that to Breaking Buddies. But and like it can load up CSS. It's also useful for building out a nav bar, right? So that like that's available everywhere in your site. Things that you want to carry on between web pages go in layout if you want them to go on everything. Cool. And the real trick, the only thing you need to know is you put layout.erb as the file name, and then you include this little yield bad boy wherever you want the rest of your code for your individual pages to go. So think of this as the template for all pages, and think of this as your code for your individual page. How are you feeling?
Is there a way to tell your controller that you don't want to use layout for the specific page?
There is, I don't remember it. But there's
But
like
it's possible.
there's ways to customize pretty much everything here.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
So is everything above the yield going to show up on every ERB file, or
When it assembles it and sends it back to the user, right? So it's going to run all this Ruby code. It's going to turn this all into HTML, and then it's going to send this all back. So yeah, every single ERB file will have all of this stuff plus, or every single HTML file that you send back from ERB will have all of this stuff plus whatever's in here.
Cool. So there's a way of having like headers and footers without like while still being like, you know, DRY.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It avoids repetition and makes a lot of like building out a lot of different pages really quick and easy. Cool.
Can you click on the controller really quick? I want to see that code where you input characters index. And you put the yield in the layout ERB.
Yep. Yield just says, here's where I want my individual, like the rest of my ERB code to go. So this, everything that's not yield is the template, is how I like to think about it.
Okay,
Cool.
thank you.
All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and call this Breaking Buddies. I'm gonna get rid of all this weird stuff. Great, and we'll eventually come back to this. But now, first off, it's been a while. Cool. So next up, whoops. Let's start actually doing some sort of RESTful stuff. So, give me 1 second. Bloop, bloop. Let's get rid of some stuff. Let's get rid of cheese.erb. I think it's, and we can keep it. But so we've got this. Which RESTful action is this?
The get HTTP verb.
So get HTTP verb. The action, it's a read. And specifically an index action, right? We'll also eventually want show, create. Whoops. New, create, edit, update, and delete. Cool. These are the things that we're going to build out. Now, what's the job of an index page?
Home page.
More than that, it's let's actually take a look back at our README.
So here you want to see like, I guess, a list of characters and be able to pull them up.
Yeah, to be able to see a lot of something, right? All is a very common one. Sometimes you will filter them, but to display like many of an item. Yeah. So here, right? Let's go ahead and get all of the characters from our database. Do people remember why I'm using this @ sign from last week?
It's because it only exists for this route, the instance, something like that.
Yeah, it's the instance variable. Yeah, that's exactly right. But more specifically, it means that you can use it inside of this view that's being rendered afterwards. Cool. Now, the reason I'm doing this here, you might be like, hey, why do I need to pass down character.all into my view? So like here, right? I could probably just call at character.all here. This is considered bad practice, especially as a student. Eventually, this is a normal thing that some developers will do. A lot of people aren't as strict about MVC, but it should not be the view's job to talk to the model. It should not be the view's job to like hit the database, especially. It should be the controller's job. And by doing this right now, you leave yourself open to way easier refactoring. If I want to make it default to all, but also do a search if there's a search parameter, having @characters here will be way easier than character.all. So this is so get used to defining your instance variables here when you need them in your views. There will be exceptions. There are times when it feels ridiculous to do it. But for like, especially something basic like this, do this here. Got it? So I'm going to render all the characters out first. So first off, I'm going to do characters that each do. See. Oh, one other thing right here. If you have not yet gotten into the habit of, if there's multiple of something, giving it an S at the end of that variable, regardless of how bad it'll make you feel in terms of conjugation. Like, I know it might be easier to do at Pokemon and at Pokemon, one relating to like a single Pokemon, one relating to many. Right at Pokemons. I know it hurts. Get over it.
What about humans?
I would just at humans. I know that Rails pluralizes human. If you're dealing with that, I'm sorry. But some sort of way to be like, hey, this is not one item. This is many items probably behaving in an array-like fashion. Put that pluralization there and make sure it's specific. If you're still doing C, please don't when you're doing stuff like that. Our goal here is to make it so that other developers will know what you're doing immediately. By putting an S there, I know that I can probably run array methods on it immediately without having to do any sort of backtracing through your code. That's important. So get into that habit now. Okay, characters that each do. Cool. You can go ahead and say C that name. Here we can do C or character. Oh, you can be a little bit loosey-goosey inside these blocks because people know exactly what you're doing, because I can look at characters to figure out what's being passed into the block. So it's very common to just use C or F or T or whatever. But let's go ahead and see what this does for us. Characters. Cool. So now we get a list of characters, not rendered pretty neatly, right? But this is a good step, right? We're indexing all of our characters. I'm gonna do a couple of little things to it to like make this look way better. But before I do we have questions about how all of these names ended up on the page? Cool. Great. So I'm gonna like make a couple of divs here. I bet I'll just call these cards. I bet that's what I did. Slash div. Div. And here, I'm also going to, right below this, I'm going to have an image. And remember, we save in our database the images for the various characters. I'm going to give it an alt tag to say, hey, if you're reading with a screen reader, include an alt tag. If you don't have an alt tag, people will judge you. Like this isn't like a, hey, if you're like a lefty and care about accessibility, this is what you do. This is like, since the 1990s, we've been putting alt tags on everything. What this will do is for screen readers, it'll describe what the image looks like. And it also is just a useful way. If the image doesn't load, it will also show that. So just get in the habit of including an alt tag every time you build an image. That is, I think, what I'm doing here. Oh, so the alt tag, right? What I'm saying here is, hey, get the character's name specifically, right? And that requires me to do some Ruby code, and that's why I'm embedding ERB here. So I'm just making the alt tag this character's name. You could be like more specific. You could be like image of or picture of.
Okay. Yeah. I didn't know that you could also put Ruby code in an image tag.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, you can do this anywhere you want, right? So what I'm saying here is the source is the URL from character.image, and the alt is picture of blah, blah, blah. Cool. Let's see what this does for us. Great. So now we have a couple of things right here. Still not very fancy. I'm going to give this a little p tag. Right. Yeah, let's just do it one line. Cool. Boop. I'm going to indent well because we're adults here. Oops. Great. Cool. So great. We'll do this right here. First step still looks very gross, right? But we now have a public folder and the layout folder, so we can load up some CSS. So I'm going to go over here, right? I'm just going to Google it because it's been a while. Link CSS. Style sheet. Great. Nice. Cool. And here in the hyperlink reference, I'm going to say, hey, go to my public. Or no, I think public is already there. So I just have to go ahead and say style sheets /styles.css. Let's see what this does. Cool. So now we got some CSS here. I prepped this in advance, but like we have these little cards. This is using Flexbox right here. But now we've got a website going, right? If you want to see the CSS for a second, we have a few different things. Like our body is this picture of happy Bryan Cranston, who's apparently like very nice person in real life from what I've heard. My former manager walked out of a building, saw Bryan Cranston walk by him, was on the phone with his wife, said, hey, holy shit, I think Bryan Cranston just passed me, to his wife. And then Bryan Cranston just walked right back up to him and said, hi, yes, I did. I'm Bryan Cranston. Very nice man. So yeah, so we've got right here, this text line center, right? I have this cards and I'm using Flexbox right here rather than grid to turn each of these cards, saying, hey, wrap them around so it doesn't just go like aligned forever in a stretch out pattern. Justify the content, space between. Say there's a gap between them. Awesome. Wow. Like this is turning into a great story, like just sharing stories about how nice Bryan Cranston is. That's nice. We're going to share this with Bryan Cranston afterwards. But so now we have a really cool page, right? Like this is a website. It's not beautiful, but it doesn't need to be. If we close it, it now has 4 because that's what Flexbox does, right? Very cool. So we now have an index page, right? And you can imagine why an index page would be useful here. It would be a little bit more annoying to print all the information about Jesse Pinkman right off the bat, right? Do you have any questions about how we did this? I know that the CSS is tempting, but like mostly in terms of like how we got everything onto the page, how we have this index page. We're about to move on to our show route.
Actually, kind of question on our project. Are we necessarily graded on how the appearance is, or that's just mostly our own ability to flex? Because I know it's like just what we have to do, and the belongs to, and the password, the session thing.
Yeah, it's not a requirement to have nicely styled CSS. I would urge you to do some because eventually you will be applying for jobs with these. And the other cautionary thing, remember that like hitting the requirements is what gets you into the room with your reviewer. Like you still have to wow them. And if you don't have any CSS, they're going to be like, all right, what'd they struggle with that they couldn't touch CSS? And then they're going to like usually I found that if you like do a really cool app but don't have any CSS, you're going to get a couple more questions. If you have really good CSS, they'll just believe that something happened. Cool.
I just wanted to glance at your ERB again, because you wrapped the CSS, but because my first intuition would have been to do something like a list of things, but you didn't do that, right? You just created divs and then wrapped those in CSS.
Yeah, a list would also make a lot of sense here, right?
Okay.
Lists have behaviors and indentations. In this case, I created cards, right?
Got it.
Because I wanted them to arrange like this.
To be cards.
But it is also very common to do something like UL li. Let's see what this does. This is just testing my CSS. Yeah, now I just have this dot that I have to get rid of. But you can get rid of li dot CSS. Nice. This is list style type. There is a way. List style type none. There we go. I think that's how you do it. Nope. Just gonna go ahead. Do this for about 30 more seconds and then stop. Ah, cool. It's the actual card. Double check that. No. Why are you mad? I might just have to like do like li done. Cool. ul. I told you I'd stop after 5 seconds, so or 30 seconds. So if this doesn't work, it's done. And it didn't work. There is a way to get rid of them. It is something you can do. Google it for a second.
Yeah.
But yeah,
the easier way would probably be to do it like you did it, because that's how it worked.
I do like. Oh, I also didn't close my tags correctly, which probably did some weird stuff to it. So that might be what happened. Using ul and li, very appropriate thing to do there. To be like, hey, this is a list and these are list items. That's more specific than div. I actually would probably prefer that. If you had to choose between the two. I'm just lazy and try to build this out.
And then is it general workflow for like building out an app with CSS and HTML and doing all of the ERB stuff? Would that be like build your ERB, everything, make it work, and then find all of the divs or whatever in the CSS sheet, and then build out what you want the CSS to do from there?
Yeah, pretty much. So what I did here, right, was I coded out my index.erb file, right, separately, like in a test run. And then like I kind of threw in classes because I knew what I was doing. I was like, I'm imagining a bunch of tiles. So I was like class cards, class card. I was also like guessing what I would like, because I was coding this and I was trying to code to anticipate me live coding in lecture. I was guessing what I would probably call this. So like typing class equals cards at the beginning was like a really good tool because I'm still in the same headspace of typing. But usually build out the HTML, then style later. First make it work, then make it sexy, then make it fast, I think. Or you can always switch the other two depending on whether you're a backend or a front end developer at heart. But yeah. Cool. So now we can get to our show page, right? Let's go ahead and do show. Anyone want to walk me through how to build a show action? Does anyone know from the labs or just want to give me their best shot? Does anyone remember the URL at least? Cool. Well, let's guess the HTTP verb.
It's get.
Yeah. So we're getting to slash characters, but then something specific, right? Like we want to be able to like give it an ID, right?
And that's a colon ID because we're using that as the
Colon ID is usually what we'd put here. Anything I just typed out some stuff rather than talking about it. Does this make sense to anything? To people? Whatever's put in the ID section right here, when they make a request this route, is captured, right? So it knows like, okay, cool. Anything in the if it's character / anything, that's going to go into the params at a key of ID and a value of 4. If I decide to instead say Batman, it would be Batman /4. A key. Batman is the key. ID is 4. If I decided to say ID here and put Batman here, we'd be getting at Batman as a value. It will not know that this is not an ID. It will not make assumptions about it being a number. Anything that's put after the slash in this route will be passed in under a key of ID. I'm going to show you where we get errors from this in a second, by the end of this lecture. But here we go. So I'm going to do an ERB characters /show, and we'll cover off on the rest of what needs to go here in a bit. Cool. First test out that this works. Cool. We can refresh this. It goes away. If I do characters / Batman right here. We get to its show page. Cool. I'm going to put a binding up right in here. Let's try this again. So this time it shouldn't show us anything. It should go right to our console. Cool. In here, we can call our params. Notice that we have a key of ID and a value of Batman. If I wanted to get the ID, I would just do this. Params, ID. Params will actually allow you to do this with just the symbol, which is cool too. So I'm going to actually just save that right now. We'll eventually change that a bit, right? But note that we've got like this ID here that's sent over whenever someone hits this route, because if I just type characters, it'll go over here, right? The moment I type something /ID, right? It'll give me that into the params. This becomes really useful. I'm going to show you why. So I'm going to get rid of this binding.py for a second. And let's actually incorporate the show page into our app before we do anything else. So our index action currently has this character name, right? I'm actually going to make this an A tag. Go ahead and say characters /character.id. So what I'm doing here, right here, is I'm saying, hey, let's comment this out. Something like that. I'm saying, hey, interpolate the character ID here. And then show me the name. So I'll show you what that does.
Could we use something like first and last name instead of ID? Or is the ID like a required?
Yes. Right now, the way that I'm going to code it uses an ID. There are other ways to do it, right? Like eventually you might want to be like, hey, I want to go to like restaurant /Thai, right? But the restful way to do it by default is to use the ID. Because what you're trying to do is relate to a single item in a database, and the easiest way to do that is by the ID. You could do it by the name, but then you've got to validate to make sure that the name is only something. There's also a bunch of tools that you'll eventually learn in Rails for stubbing your links differently. That's like an optional thing. It's worth looking into a blog about, where you go ahead and say like, hey, my show page should relate to my name, or it should relate to a stub version of my name. These are all tools that you will have access to. And I think Sinatra has those tools. I've only seen them in Rails. Super worth looking into for a blog post. But the most basic version is just use an ID. Cool. So if we refresh our characters page now. I don't want no slash. Cool. Now we've got links here and we can click on Walter White. And it'll bring us to character/187. Cool. We'll put the binding.pry back. Ideally, or actually first off, let's go ahead and say meet at character.name. This should break first time, right? Because we haven't defined an at character here. Cool. It says, hey, no undefined method name for nil class. We know what this means, right? It doesn't mean that there's no method called name. It means there's no method called name for nil class. For a nil, it means we're passing in nil and trying to call name on it. Cool. So now our next step is to actually get the right character and define at character. Cool. I'm putting in a binding.pry. I'm going to comment this one out because I think that that's a couple steps more than you'll usually take. But can somebody tell me how, given this request, I can find Walter White? And I'll give you a hint of calling params right now.
By writing ID 1?
ID 1, do you say?
Yes.
So if I say ID 1, currently the ID is 187, right? And if I actually go to Walter White, you'll find that his ID is 187. We've reset the database a few times. So we can't just hard code in 1 here. But from params, right? Using params, is there any way we can get access to Walter White?
Like find is like, but defaults to ID, right? So it's just the character dot find and then the params ID.
That's exactly right. This will go ahead and give me the character. This becomes a really common bit of code. You're going to be using this all the time. There are two options here, actually. At character equals character.find params ID. If you don't want it to error out if someone gives you an incorrect character, which you should, like, generally speaking, if someone's typing random IDs into your URL, you probably don't want to serve them a response. But the alternative is just wanted to remind you of this. I actually don't even want to include this right now because I think this is like a really normal piece of code that you're going to be using a lot for the next 4 phases. You're going to be using this forever. This at something equals something.find params to the key of ID. Very common. What I want you to do, you're going to be using this over and over again. Even like you're going to be using this 4 times in this controller. So with that in mind, make sure you understand what you're doing here. You're saying, hey, go to the character table and find me the character with the params that you fed in, ID that we fed in here. Cool. So now we can build out our show page. Now we've got this character. We can test this out first to make sure it works. Exit. Try this one more time. meet Walter White. So now we can go ahead and build out. First of all, I just want to double check that I've got this entirely correct. Cool. Character. Great. I called it character. Great. You can start building out the actual features of this, right?
Did we do something earlier that I missed to layout to make it not show anymore? Like, why is the layout not showing?
That's actually a very good question. Did I just... It is interesting that it's not showing. Am I doing something unusual here?
And did you say like it only like looks for an index ERB, and do we have to like specify that this is like not an index or something for layout?
No,
or?
it should be showing my layout here.
'Cause even on index, it wasn't showing anymore after you added the CSS in.
Index. What? So this one works. This for some reason isn't rendering. Refuse to apply style from... I'm Googling this. Why is it trying to get for character slash style sheet slash CSS? Let's take a look. A CSS library starting with comments. Let's double check everything first. Show doesn't start with comments. My styles.css doesn't start with comments. Let's take a look really quickly to make sure that it at least in the elements. Style sheets.styles.css. Oh, right. Whoops. Fascinating. This definitely didn't happen in my test run. I'm going to stare at this for about Go Google this one more time. See what's up, and then after that, I might just drop it into the Slack channel. Maybe I need a dot slash. Let's take a look. Unusual. We'll get back to it, I think, in a bit. This is something that is a new era to me, and we've only got 7 minutes left. I'm not going to cover forms today because we're nearly out of time, and it's a big topic. But it's going to be the entire topic of our next lecture on Thursday. Is everyone cool with that? So I'm just gonna build this out and do one more thing. Super weird. Cool. Go ahead and create my, whoops. Just gonna copy these bad boys right here because I'm lazy. Yeah, I'm definitely gonna put the error on Slack. We're done. Oop. Cool. I'm gonna do character name. Ah, foolish. Cool. We don't need the name. We don't need the image. But I just want to like get through this real quick. Add the rest of these features. Cool. So this is going to be the generic show page. Whoops. I think there's a couple of other things I want to do here before we're done with the show page. Cool. Back to not having any CSS. So the issue is it's doing localhost 3000 / style sheets, which is unusual because it's saying do /. Oh, 1 second. Let's try that real quick. I don't know if that'll work. Nope. And that image is also not loading, which is super unusual. But fortunately, if we add an alt tag, yeah.
This looks, maybe you need to add some kind of like type /CSS in the link attribute.
That is very, well, we've got this relative style sheet. We'll solve this later. I think right now I just want to show one more thing and then we can log off. So we've got these. Some things are weird about them. It turns out my actor feature also didn't work. But now we can go ahead and start doing some other stuff too, right? We're not limited in what we do here. So I can go ahead and say @character.messages, right? This is something we can call .each do message end. And now here, if I type message, does anyone know what I'll see?
A message object? No.
That's actually was what I was looking for. It's not. Oh, now you decide to show up.
Do you see nothing because you're not actually putting any HTML in yet?
You actually see 3 hashes. That hash is going to be how Sinatra represents, hey, this is an active record object. This is a very common error, and I want you all to get used to spotting it. This is very confusing, right? Hashes don't tell us anything. Rails will be much more specific. It's like active record collection, blah, 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 and then some huge ID. This is going to be what you're going to see, and it's going to throw you off during your review because you'll be like, I don't know. I've never seen this before. And it'll really just be that your brain's freezing over because it's a review. And those hashes are just the object. The object doesn't have any rules about how to render itself. In order to actually render itself, we do like message.content or div class. I eventually want this to be full of my cool styling that I worked so hard on. I worked like 20 minutes worth of hard on. Cool. You can go ahead and say message.user.username says colon. Whoops. Let's go ahead and and then I broke something. Syntax error, line 20. Of my show.erb. Interesting. I don't have a line 20 here. But I do notice that this is currently, there we go. Let's just go ahead and do it this way. Cool. Now what am I doing wrong? There we go. End of string. Cool. SpongeBob SquarePants says Happy Teacher Appreciation Day. SpongeBob SquarePants also says keep grinding. And SpongeBob SquarePants says hey there. Cool. You can now do one more thing to make our website actually usable, because right now we're just stuck here and we'd have to like click back or something. I'm going to go back into our layout.html.erb, and we are going to right here create a little nav bar. Nav /nav. And then we can go ahead and say href equals /characters. And then we can go ahead and say right here, see all characters, exclamation point. Refresh the page. What the heck? It's just not loading my layouts at all. I'll get rid of this too. Cool. So that was a little cursed, but now we have like the CL characters thing. I'm going to figure out what's up and I will share that with you. I'm going to also check my application controller really quickly. App/views layout.erb. Huh. Cool. Well, before I let you go, any last questions? And then on Thursday, we're going to dive into forms and do all of the CRUD actions. And it was always weird when we end on an error, but this is development. How are we feeling? Thumbs up, thumbs sideways, thumbs down, with the exception of one weird bit of confusion on the layouts. Cool. All right. No thumbs downs though. Okay. I will let you all go. And Alex, I will check out that link. All right. Later, everyone.
I don't know if that's helpful, but thank you.
Thank you.
All right.